Clayton, you're going to have to be real still and real quiet for as long as you possibly can. So
Oh, my
you
goodness.
can hear them talking,
Oh,
okay?
my goodness.
Dum dum dum.
Oh, you're asking a lot.
Mildred started out by telling us what day it is and telling us what you know about your father and mother on both sides of the family. And Wilson, you can talk to your mom and ask her to clarify things you don't know about.
Well, I don't know what day this is.
May the 6th. 7th.
Well, this is May the 7th, 1988. And I want to tell you something about my mother and my father. My father came from Hardin Springs, Kentucky, when he was a young man. He had 5 brothers and 3 sisters, as well as I remember. I never met either one of my grandparents. They had both passed away by the time I was born. So I did not know my grandparents walker. I do remember some of the aunts and uncles that I saw from time to time. But Grandpa decided to come west and seek his fortune from Hardin Springs, Missouri. Now, I'm not sure that he was in on the Oklahoma run, where they lined up across the prairie and went out to find the land. But I'm not sure he was in on that. But he came in the early 1900s, about 1903, I think. Then Grandpa Clark, Fred Clark, and his wife, Letty, came from East Lynn, Missouri, with their 4 daughters. Grandpa Clark had polio when he was a young man.
Is that on your mother's side or your dad's side?
This is on my mother's father, on my mother's side. I don't know any much more about Grandpa Walker's family. Grandpa Walker's name was Benjamin Dick Joseph. And he hated the Dick in there. And he never did figure out why he had 3 names anyway, I guess. So he just went by B.J. Walker and was mostly called Ben or B.J. Okay. Then on Grandma Brannon's side, mother's side, her daddy had polio when he was small, and he had one pretty bad foot, and his daddy wanted him to be a lawyer. And so he sent him to school to train him to do something where he could sit at a desk, because he thought that since Grandpa was crippled that it would be easier for him to handle in life and make a living. But Grandpa Clark didn't want that. He wanted to be a farmer. So against all the persuasions of his daddy, well, he started farming there at East Lynn, Missouri, and married Letty Liddick. And I would have to check the family history to be sure how many there was in her family. But I know she had one sister that was a maiden lady. And she's the only one that I remember from the Liddick side of the family. And she was Verna Liddick. And she's the one that painted that pastels, that picture, you know, that I have there in the bedroom. She's the one that painted that. She did a number of real nice paintings. She was very gifted. And I think this is an interesting story that you might like to know about Aunt Verna. She had a young beau, and she was pretty serious about getting married to him. And her mother died. So she told him that she couldn't get married because she had to go through this period of mourning, and also she had to take care of her father. So the young man waited very patiently for several years while Aunt Verna took care of her father. Well, then the father died, and the young man came around and said, now it's time to get married. Well, she didn't think that he had waited a proper amount of time after her father had passed away. So she set him on his way again, and he never returned, and she never married. And I remember her coming to our house to visit when I was small. In fact, one time she moved out there from Kansas City, where she was living, to live with us, I guess, because I know she brought quite a bit of her stuff, including what I would call a pigeonhole desk. And she didn't want this nosy little kid poking around in her desk.
Who was a nosy little kid?
I was the nosy little kid. She didn't want me poking around in that desk, so she forbade me to touch that desk. And every time Aunt Verna would turn her back.
You was in the desk.
No, I don't remember that I ever got into it. But I'd go and I'd stand and I'd look at all those little different little cubby holes in that little desk, you know. And when she wasn't looking, I'd reach out and just touch the desk itself. That was the naughty coming out in me. Okay. Grandpa and Grandma came out from Missouri to Brown Beaver. We called it a little community by the name of Gray, Oklahoma. They loaded all of their stuff on a train car. Grandpa went on the train to feed the animals, and they had all the household goods on there. He had already been to where he was going to move there in Oklahoma and had made arrangements with several of the neighbors to come up with their wagons and to meet them at Liberal to help transport all of their stuff down to the farm that Grandpa had bought. The women came on the train, on the passenger train. They got there before Grandpa did, the night before, and had to put up at the hotel. And all I remember Mother telling about that was that the hotel was infested with fleas. Because the fleas, at certain times of the year, according to the weather, they would travel through the prairie grass. And they just infested everything that was ahead of it, whether it was houses or whatever it was. And this happened in later years too. That wasn't the only time that it happened. So I guess that every once in a while when there was a prairie fire, I guess it was kind of a blessing in a way. It helped get rid of the fleas. that was in the grass, so you don't ever know about those things. Okay, so Grandpa gets in with this boxcar full of stuff and it's prearranged. I don't know how many of the neighbors came up to meet them there, but they loaded all of their stuff onto wagons, and it took 2 days to make the trip from Liberal, Kansas, back down to Gray, Oklahoma, with their household stuff.
How far was that?
No, it wasn't about 80 mile, I imagine, something like that, 60.
It wasn't very far, but by wagon.
It's a long ways if you got a
Quite a
horse.
ways, yeah.
But he had a house cut up and he brought it in?
I don't know whether he had it pre-cut or not, but he brought the lumber from Missouri to build the house, nails and everything. He even brought fruit trees to put out, and grapevines, and all of these nice things that they grew in Missouri. He brought a variety of all of this with him to put out up there in that desolate area where there wasn't any water.
Why did he choose that part of the country to go?
Who knows? Who knows why he chose it? The same reason my daddy's free, I imagine.
Why they decided to move there from where they were at? Do you have any idea?
No, I really don't. Just the adventure of it, I suppose. I don't really know why they chose to come to that part of the country. Other than, like Wilson said, the land was free, you know, the government was giving it away, and all you had to do was to go in there and drive down your stakes on your homestead, and within a year, I think it was, you had to put some type of an improvement. A building or something had to be put up on that homestead to show that you were serious about settling up there. And so Daddy did that. Okay, so Grandpa moves into this area with 4 marrying age teenage girls from 19 years to about 17, you know, years old, 20 maybe. And Elsie might have been 20 years old. And he moved down there into this pack of bachelors from all over the country. And those bachelors snapped them eligible, marrying girls up in no time flat. And of course, Aunt Elsie was the oldest. And she was the first one married in the bunch, I think. And then the rest of them followed suit pretty close after. Now, one of the girls married by the name of Eva, and she died when twins were born. And they are buried at Blue Mountain Cemetery up there close to Gray. My mother and Daddy started out there in Oklahoma. My 2 older sisters were born there, and I don't think that they were born in a dugout. I think that they had a little house.
Was your mother one of those 4 eligible girls?
She was one of those 4 girls.
Where did
The
she fit
second.
in it? The second one.
It was Aunt Elsie, Bertie, Tessa, and Eva.
What was your mother's name?
Bertie Elma. Bertie Elma Clark. And I don't remember what Aunt Elsie's other name was. But Aunt Elsie had married Charlie Stagner, and she was expecting the 3rd child. She had 2 girls and was expecting that 3rd one. And Uncle Charlie got kicked in the stomach by a horse. And just laid his stomach open, I guess. And he just lived 24 hours, something like that, a day and a half maybe after that. And then the 3rd child was born, which was Levi Stagner, 6 weeks, I think, after Uncle Charlie died. And Aunt Elsie continued to live there, and she lived in a half dugout. And all of my children remember going to see Aunt Elsie and the half dugout. In fact, if you go there now, you will still see the half dugout. A half dugout had short windows above the ground, 4 panes of glass. A full dugout wouldn't have any windows at all. You left the door open and lit the interior with kerosene lamps. But it was the most common way of housing your family because there wasn't anything else available to do.
Well, the walls was made out of
Above ground,
stucco, sod,
sod.
buffalo grass sod, and it had a dirt top on it.
They brought sod busters, what they called them, with them. Plows, sod buster plows, and they would cut that buffalo grass so deep and so wide, and then they'd stack that stuff. But Aunt Elsie's wasn't made like that. Aunt Elsie's was adobe. You remember, Wilson? And the adobe was the buffalo grass mixed with mortar, I guess, and poured into a mold and set up brick-like. And of course, they're still common in the western part of the United States now. But that was what her half dugout was built out of.
They call it a half dugout because it had windows in it.
Right.
When did she marry Noah?
Okay, then I don't know just how much later it was, but she had the 3, and then Uncle Lambert came to that area, and he had 3 boys and a girl. Faye and Lewis and Leslie and Warren, Noe. And he married Aunt Elsie with her 3, Thelma, Esther, and Levi. And they had Paul. So we had 8 altogether. And Aunt Tessa married, and she had 4 boys. I don't remember a whole lot about them because they moved to California when I was still pretty small, so I don't remember a lot about them. Other than after Sharon and Wilson, after we had our whole family, we would go to California to visit she and Uncle Jay.
Tell how strong Uncle Jay's toes were.
Yeah, Uncle Jay was real unique in the fact that he had very strong toes, and he loved to tease the kids when we would go out there in later years to visit it. He'd pinch them with his toes, and he could.
His toes were pretty long too, weren't they?
And I don't remember about that, but he could really pinch them. They thought that was so funny.
He picked up a chair with his toes one time, remember?
What did he do? Was he a welder, or did he have a machine shop type? Mechanic?
Machine shop.
I think so. Something like that. But anyway, he would work at the shop during the day, and then his hobby was crocheting. And he would come home of an evening and crochet to relax. That was Uncle Jay's hobby. Uncle Jay was a little bitty, wiry fella. Of course, all of the Clarks were small people. And not much over 5 foot. I don't know which one of the girls was the tallest. It would have been a toss-up because there's all about 5 foot, 5'1". So there's all little people. Aunt Elsie's husband was pretty good size. But Uncle Jay came from over at Hontoon, just west of Perryton was the area that he came from, and he was small, slight-built individual. And I never did know Aunt Eva's husband. I didn't. She had died before I was born, and they had moved, and I never did know them. Okay, so Mother and Daddy stayed there in around Gray, Oklahoma, there in Beaver County, till my oldest sister was 6. Then Grandpa got wandering feet again, and he decided that he wanted to go to Idaho. So he bought this old touring car. Was it a Dodge? Daddy, do you remember from the pictures?
No.
Anyway, it had the little curtains, you know, on the sides. 2-seated. And I remember pictures of them getting ready to take their trip. And they had this crate of chickens on the side and some other boxes with food in it so that they could cook along the way and have some meat to eat. Now, I don't know whether Daddy had a gun to do any hunting with or not. I never remember. This kind of seems like I do remember Daddy having a gun, but I never saw him fire it. I guess he did. I think he had a shotgun. But he wasn't much of a hunter. And they went to Idaho and stayed, and Daddy sold his homestead. They stayed 1 winter. It rained all the time they was out there, and they couldn't stand all that water after living in Beaver County, Oklahoma, where they might get 2 inches or 3 inches during a year. So in the spring of the year, they came back, and this time, Daddy bought a homestead from another fella down in Ogletree County, Texas, just 3 miles, 2 miles, 3 miles this side of the Oklahoma line in the Texas Panhandle. And this homestead already had a 3-room full dugout. And like Daddy said a while ago, they would put wood over the top of it and then pile dirt on top of that. Oh, and Aunt Elsie, I don't remember, she had a cellar besides the dugout, and then later on too, they put a sod house attached to the half dugout. But she couldn't keep us kids off the cellar. We kept going down the cellar on our wagons and scooting down it and so forth, and she couldn't keep the dirt up there. So she finally got out there and planted prickly pears on top of the dugout to keep us kids.
You did.
Off at the top of the cellar. It worked. Aunt Elsie's and Uncle Lambert's only child, Paul, he and I were closer together in age, so we were always best of friends. So we've always said we were favorite cousins because everybody else was so much older than what we were. And Daddy bought down there, and my older sisters, you remember, one night, one of the horses got loose, and he ran across the top of the dugout. And one of his hind legs came through, right up closer above the bed where the girls were sleeping. And of course just showered them with dirt. But the horse had enough momentum to it that he pulled his leg out and kept going and didn't come on through the ruin. Grandma tells another time about that old dugout, that she was there and Grandpa had gone into Perryton. Now this was 6 miles east and a mile north of Perryton by an elevator called Twitter. And I used to tell people that my town was a mile through it because it was a mile from the elevator to the school where Daddy had donated the land. So he had donated a piece of our land for the school to go in because Daddy really wanted his children to have some education. Another thing that Grandma was telling, that I was thinking about, was that Grandpa was gone, Grandma was there with the new baby, Marvin. and a snake got into the little dugout there with Grandma and the baby. And I said, what did you do, Mother? She said, I let him have it. She grabbed the baby and hauled it to the girls, and they took off and let Grandpa come home and take care of the snake. Another time, when Grandpa was gone, came up a quick thunderstorm, just raining real hard, and the water found a way, worked a hole, and found a way to pour into the dugout. And Mother said it looked like they was all going to be drowned like a bunch of holes in a rats in a hole, you know. So she went, put an old coat around her and went up and tried to get enough mud and sticks or whatever was available to grass and poke it in that hole to try to stop it up enough that there wouldn't too much water run down in there and make mud, because the floors were dirt. And you swept the floors only enough to keep it hard, and you sure didn't want it muddy down in there. And of course, eventually, when you swept those floors enough, you would wear out the dirt in between the furniture.
Oh, you would.
So the bed would gradually become elevated, as well as the stove, the table, and the benches.
You were singing and everything else was right.
Slowly get a trail going through the house.
Yeah, that's what you would get eventually. But by the time I was born, Grandpa Walker took this notion that he was going to make $1 million by raising chickens. Now, what he didn't take into consideration was, if you're going to sell something, you got to have a market for it. And everybody in the country raised their own chickens. Who ever heard of a farm without chickens? So Daddy built this 3-room chicken house. Roof slanted to the back like this, high in the front, short on the back, had little windows back there, and adequate ventilation with windows in the front. Cement floor, and we were going to live there until he could build us a regular house. Well, the Depression came along, and the
You were living in the chicken house then?
so we were living in this glorified chicken house. It wasn't a real bad house to live in. But anyway, we lived there. I lived there as long as I was on that farm. I was there in that chicken house. And my older sister, Hazel, went to school at God's Bible School, Cincinnati, Ohio, when I was 4 years old, because she was that much older than what I was. She had graduated from high school and went to Cincinnati to go to school. And we took her from Tarleton to Hardin Springs, Missouri, and from there she got a ride with a cousin, Jimmy Brown, on up to Cincinnati. Well, that was the first time in my life that I had ever been on a trip of any distance whatsoever.
How old were you?
4. I had never seen a black person to that point, even though there was a town law in Perryton that you could not, a Negro could not be in town after sunset. That was just the town law. I don't know why they had it, because there wasn't any blacks there anyway. They wanted to be sure there wasn't any, I guess. But I was acting up in the car. I was a warty little old kid. Had lots of energy and didn't want to sit still. And my sisters kept telling me if I didn't be good, that a black person was going to get me. Well, we eventually, I don't know where we got to, but we eventually got over to some place to where there were some black people. And there were some of them coming down the sidewalk. And I looked out the car window and I saw these black people, and I absolutely was literally scared to death. And I got down in the floorboard of the car and I cried and they couldn't even pull me. I was really petrified, and that was and I've often thought about that, and they felt real bad after they saw how seriously I had taken their words. Then my second sister, Elma, went to Cincinnati, to God's Bible School also, when I was 6 years old. They both married and stayed in the East. Hazel married Kenneth Brannon and had 4 sons. Alma married Ed Honeycutt from West Virginia. Kenneth was from Pennsylvania. They raised their children in the East, and we didn't see them very often. In fact, there wasn't enough money for Mother and Daddy to
What
go.
profession was Kenneth in?
He was a minister. And for a while, and then later in life, well, he turned into a salesman for a company by the name of Ellison. Anyway, we didn't see each other across the years too much, so I really was a lot closer to the McGuire family than I was my own brothers and sisters.
Now, both your older
Wasn't
sisters
around.
went to a Bible college of some
Went to
sort, didn't they?
Cincinnati to God's Bible School.
And what church were they members of?
I think that was a non-denominational thing. The little country church that we attended when I was a child was there at Blue Mound, and that's what it was, and I think this was a non-denominational type holiness school also. And so both of them married ministers, and they have lots of stories to tell too. But when I was, as far as I can remember, I had a very happy childhood. We never had anything. We were just as poor can be, but I knew that I was loved. And Mother and Daddy, I guess, had me in church from the time I was small. When I was born, Mother almost died. And then she had erysipelas, and I forget what else, milk leg, I think. Anyway, she was real sick. And the girls was taking care of me, supposedly, and I slept so much of the time. And they thought that was just great because I slept so much, and they almost let me starve to death.
Oh, right.
And I didn't weigh much more when I was 3 months old than I did when I was born. And Mother was too sick to even really notice that things was going that badly. Well, she did tell me one time that she prayed that some woman would come and take the baby and take care of it until she could get well enough to take care of me herself. And in later years, after I was, I don't know, a great big kid, one of our neighbor ladies, Mrs. Oliver Carter, that lived just west of us for about a mile, she said, you know, when that baby was born, she said one day I had the strongest impression that I should go over and offer to take care of that baby until you got well enough to take care of it yourself. And she said, I was afraid they didn't have but one adopted son. That's all they had. And she was afraid that Mother would think that she was trying to take her baby away from her. And so she didn't make the offer. Now that just goes to show you that we sometimes need to follow the promptings of our heart. They could be from the Lord, you know. But anyway, I survived. Grandma got well, and I guess I probably was 6 weeks or 2 months old before I went to church because of Mother's illness. Daddy, from the time I remember, always had a car, and before that, but we also had horses. And in the winter time, we would hook the horses up to the wagon, and we had straw in the back of it, and we had adequate comforts, quilts, and we'd wrap up and ride to church in the wagon in the winter time because there wasn't any antifreeze for the cars, and the cars would freeze up, so you couldn't take the car.
No, so you get drained.
It was cold. So we went to church in the wintertime in the wagon and with the horses, and in the summertime we went in the car.
Now, didn't Grandma usually heat the hot irons?
Oh,
to
yes.
wrap y'all in?
We had an old Majestic cook stove, and had a warming closet on the top, and Grandma kept the flat irons that I still have. She has, we'd keep those up there in those warming closets, and she'd wrap those up in.
Oh, it was a warming closet, used to place to put the flat on.
You can't put, if you wanted to, you could put your food up there and keep it warm. It was a big old Majestic stove, and at one end it had a tank that held water. And when you cooked your food, you heated the water. And then these were up over the top. And you can cook food ahead of time and set it up there and keep it warm till you got all of your food cooked. One time we had come home from church in the wintertime, and of course the Watkins man would come through occasionally, and Mother'd buy things from him. Well, she bought her pepper in the pound cans. So we came home from church, and oh, it was cold. And we were all just so cold by the time we had gotten home from church. So Grandpa Walker went in, was fumbling around, trying to find the matches in the dark to light the lamp. And the cook stove was still warm. Now that was the only stove we had in the house. And of a night, the cook stove would go out. And you had to have adequate cover or you'd freeze to death.
Well, it's pretty cold.
Yeah, it was burning coal, so it would stay on. Marvin's bed was in the kitchen where the stove was. Mine was at the other end of the house, and Mother and Daddy slept in the middle. Well, Daddy was fumbling around, hunting the matches, and he hit that can of black pepper and fell down on the top of that warm stove. The lid came off, and that black pepper started burning on the top of the stove. And we were just choking from all that pepper in the kitchen. So then we had to open the door and the windows. Oh, Grandpa was unhappy. He was really unhappy because he had done that. Another time, and I don't know, it was warm weather, but we started the church, and a skunk ran out in front of us. We hit that skunk. And
In the car or
with the car. And it really perfumed us good. And we had to turn around and go back home because we all stunk so bad we moved. Nobody would welcome us at church then. Okay. Another time, we came home from church, and the skunk had come up, and the dogs had got after it and chased that skunk around. Well, he finally let the dogs have it, and also the bedroom where Elma and I slept. He sprayed the door of that bedroom. And oh, we came home and the dog stunk, the house stunk. And for years after that, of course, the doors were just old wood doors. And I don't remember they ever had a lick of paint on them. And when that skunk sprayed those doors, that wood absorbed that scent. And every time we would have a rain, you could smell that scent of that skunk for years after that. And I remember Alma getting a nosebleed. So I probably was about 5 years old when that happened. Daddy had about, what did Daddy have, 4 section of land. And he had some good wheat crops there. He had several horses. And I remember the horse that I rode occasionally. Of course, they were work horses. We didn't even, I don't know why other people rode horses, but we didn't do much horseback riding, even though we had them. They were work horses. But this little old horse was named Maud. And Maud, Daddy'd send me out to herd the cows on this little reddish brown mare. And she'd shy at anything. And I didn't have any saddle, just bareback. And that little old mare would shy from a piece of paper or anything, tumbleweed, anything that went across the road. And she'd just stiffen out those front legs just as hard as she could, and I'd go over her head just like that on the ground, and she'd throw her tail up in the air the way she'd head home, leaving me a foot.
Oh, she would. She wouldn't stop and wait on you to get on.
Oh no, she's gone. She wouldn't go home. About the only 2 spankings that I remember my daddy giving was one time it had rained and the ground had kind of cracked up, and made crust on top of the ground. Well, we didn't always go to church on Sunday night. So Marvin didn't, and I didn't know that Daddy had in his head to go to church that night. And he sent us out to get the cows, to bring them up to milk so we could go to church. Except Marvin and I was so interested. We were barefooted, spring of the year, and we were so interested in walking on these crackles and squashing them with our toes that we dilly-dallied and played along the way, getting the cows, and on the way back home too. And Daddy was quite put out with us when we arrived home, and he spanked us. And I think that was the first time I ever remember my daddy spanking me. Mother pounded on us quite often with the razor strap, but Daddy didn't do too much popping. He didn't have to. He could just cross his eyes at us, and boy, we straightened up in a hurry. Another time I remember him spanking me, he told me to turn on the water down at the hog pen so the hogs would be watered. He had piped the water down from the well to the hog pen. Well, there was an old sow down there, and I was scared of that old sow, because they're mean as everything when they got a bunch of babies. And she looked at me cross-eyed, and man, I took off. I was deathly scared of those hogs. I hated them with a purple passion. And Daddy came in from a hard day's work, and them pigs hadn't been watered, and that could have been very tragic. I don't remember that there was any dead ones, but it's a wonder there weren't some dead ones. And so I got a spanking because I didn't water those pigs like I should have. That's all the 2 times that I can remember Daddy giving me a spanking. One time I think he should have spanked me, that he didn't. And by this time I probably was 10 years old, 9 or 10 years old. And I deserved to be it. But I was sitting with some other kids in church. And we was a-giggling and a-cutting up. And I happened to glance over where Mother and Daddy was sitting. And Daddy was a crooking his finger at me. come there. And I was a spiteful, hateful little thing anyway. So I got up all right. But instead of going over and sitting down my mother and daddy, like a good girl, like I was told to do, I just marched out of the church, right straight on out the door. And I looked around, and who do you think was right behind me? And he didn't say a word. He just took me by the shoulder, and we marched down the aisle, and I sat with his grandma. There wasn't a word said on the way home. But when I got home, by the time I got home, I mean, tell you, I just knew he was going to kill me.
It might be a good time to start the tale about when you were up singing a trio and I was acting up in church and you finished your song. What'd you do to me?
I don't remember about that. You'll have to tell that
I
yourself.
was sitting with Nancy Lowe and Nathan Grimes, and we acted up through the whole song, and Aline and you and somebody else, I think it was you, was up singing a trio, and you kept giving me the look, and I kept looking away, telling me to straighten up. We were giggling and talking and carrying on. So the minute you finished singing that trio, you walked right off the platform. The other two ladies went the opposite direction, and you came marching down that aisle, and you reached over and grabbed me by my ear and my shoulder, jerked me right up, and walked right down the middle of the aisle and set me down on the front for the second row right beside you and made me sit there the rest of the church time.
How old was you? Well, if
It
Barbie
was
and Eileen
Nathan.
was there, you'd have to be
About
about,
11.
yeah. You'd be about the same
So
time I pulled my
your daddy
stuff.
gave you some bad ideas.
Well, when we got home that night, I remember going in the house and Mother saying, "Now, Mildred, you know, don't you, that was a terrible, ugly thing for you to do at church. And now, I don't know what your daddy's going to do to you, but whatever he does, I just want you to know that you deserve every bit of it." She said, "You embarrassed the whole family, and you deserve whatever you get."
Now, Wilson never had problems in church.
He always went to sleep.
Wilson, you went to sleep and never woke up till church was over. And tell about the time that you left him there.
Well, we couldn't find him. Did we ever leave him at church? We just couldn't find him one night.
You woke him up and sent him to the car, and he lay back down on another pew and went back to sleep. And you got home and he wasn't in the car, and you had to go back, and he was still on the pew asleep.
One time,
You didn't know he was wet.
No, he never got in trouble. He just went to sleep.
he went to sleep in church. Now this was at Plainview. And I got him on his feet, had him on the way to the car, and somebody stopped me and started talking to me. So he kept going on, you know. Got out to the car, and he wasn't there. And we was hunted and hunted and hunted. We was afraid that he had crawled in somebody else's car, and they carried him off, and we didn't know where he was. And finally, we found him, and we went around the church, and there he was, sitting on the basement steps, with his chin in his hands like this, sound asleep. Well, that's back to Perryton, Texas. The Dust Bowl days came in. And this was bad times for everybody in the Texas Panhandle and Oklahoma Panhandle and Kansas and all across the area. But the farmers had dug up so much of the prairie grass, not enough water, so the dirt began to blow. There was lots of people that just moved away and left their homes, just left with what they could carry and just moved away. we were too poor to move, didn't have any place to go if we'd have tried. And of course, it was borrowing money to put out wheat in the fall. In the spring of the year, it'd blow out. And so then Daddy would do some more. Next fall, he'd plant some more wheat. And this dirt blew sometimes 2 or 3 days, night and day. Didn't even let up. And I remember Mother saying that it was so bad when the dirt was a-blowing that you couldn't leave. And it would be so pretty after the dirt quit blowing and you were so busy getting the dirt out of the house you didn't want to leave. So we stayed. Until it just really got bad, and we had to sell off the cattle because there wasn't any grain to feed them. There was very few chickens left. The horses had all been sold off by this time. And, well, not all of them either, because Daddy still had to have some work horses. So there was a lawyer there in Perryton, Texas, by the name of Flowers. And he had some land down by McGuire, Arkansas, on the Mississippi River. And he told Daddy if he would go down there and clear, ever how much land he cleared, he would give him equivalent for himself in payment for clearing this land. So Daddy bought an old truck, and he had a trailer too, I guess, because I know he took the tractor, old John Deere, or Alice Chalmers. Daddy always had an Alice Chalmers truck. He took the tractor, he took horses, I don't remember just how many. Levi Stagner, my cousin, went with us to help. Marvin was about 13. No, Marvin would have been 13, because I turned 10 while we were there. And Levi was a couple of years older, he would have been about 50. And he went with us to help clear this land. So Daddy got down there, and they all got started clearing the land. And the sheriff come out and stopped him and told him that he could not take any lumber off of that land till the back taxes was paid. Well, in those days, it was really something if you got sent a telegram, you know. But Daddy wrote letters and didn't get any response from that to this lawyer up there in Perryton. And then he sent a telegram, and he did everything that he knew to do to get this fellow to pay the taxes on that land so that he could continue clearing it. And the man never would pay the taxes, and we were stranded up Salt Creek, and there just hardly was any jobs to be found. And I guess that was the closest that we ever came to starving to death, was that particular winter. I know one time Daddy worked all day, and the man paid him in a bushel of pecans. And another time, he got paid for a day's work with a bushel of sweet potatoes. And things were real rough. Now, we had to buy our own books, school books, in Arkansas there. And also, they had a state law that you had to be vaccinated for smallpox before you could go to school. Texas didn't have that law then. So I got my first smallpox vaccination. And I kept going to school, and we called it playing push-up. There was the brick wall of the school like this, and then I guess it was jutted out and back in, perhaps for a fireplace or something. Well, we like to line each other up down this wall, you know. And whoever stayed right here where the little indention in the wall was, the longest, well, he was the king of the group, you know. So we'd get out there and we'd elbow each other and try to push each other out of the way. And I kept getting my arm bumped and knocked the scab off of the top of my smallpox vaccination. So Mother would write notes and send it to school and tell the teacher to keep me in at recess, not let me go out and play so that arm could get healed up. And I'd throw the note away and go back out and play push-ups. So I was a rascal. I remember at Christmas time that year, we never really got much for Christmas at all, but that particular year, I got a ribbon for my hair. I always had long curls, and Mother would take this part of my hair here and make one long curl to hang over the others, and she'd tie a bow right up here. And so she got me this piece of ribbon. I imagine it cost 3 cents or maybe 5 cents, but that was Christmas. And my brother didn't get anything. And that really upset me. And I remember just crying and crying because I got something for Christmas and Martha didn't get anything. But Mother did take some of those pecans, and she managed to make us some fudge on Christmas Eve, and we were going to have some candy for Christmas. And that night, she had set it out to cool, and that night a mouse got in our candy.
Oh, right.
And nibbled on our candy. Of course, Mother knew it and ran all over the top of that candy, you know. So she threw the candy away. We couldn't eat it. Well, the neighbor children found out that there hadn't been any Christmas in our house. And I don't remember that I minded there not being Christmas in our house. It was, the thing that hurt was that Marvin didn't get something. And so one day Mother dressed me up the best she could and tied my new bow ribbon in my hair and told me that there was going to be a party over at one of my little friends' house across a vacant lot from us, and that I was to go over there. It was a party. And I thought, oh boy, this is going to be fun. So off I went with my hair all slicked up and my feed sack dress on, and I was going to go to a party. And I'd never been to a party before that I knew of. Didn't really know what I was going to take place even. So I got over there, and a bunch of the neighborhood children had gotten together, and they had each selected some of their toys that were still in good shape, and they gave me a Christmas party. An after Christmas party. And you'll never know how much I treasured those things. And one of the things that I highly treasured was a box of paper dolls. And the little figures, the little dolls, was cut out, but in this box was sheets of paper like material. And you could make your own clothes. And I treasured those. I had them for a long time. My favorite doll before that was an old tin-headed doll. And I used to just buy the heads and the shoulders of a doll, and then you put it on the body. So if the body wore out, you could take the head off, make another body, and put the head back on. Well, it was metal of some kind. I always say it was a tin-headed doll, but I don't know, it was metal of some kind. And I wore out 3 bodies on that doll. And I think most of them was worn out from hitting Marvin over the head or wherever I could hit him. I'd take that doll by one leg, he'd get to teasing me, and I'd let him have it, the bad doll.
How much older was he?
He was 3 years, just old enough to just torment me good. And he just tormented the life out of me, but I loved him. I fiercely loved that brother of mine and still do. But we finally, Daddy would not move us out of school again after we had moved to Arkansas that year, because he had already moved us once and he did not think that we should do that. So we existed, we got by, we made it somewhere. I don't know what we lived on, but we made it. And after school was out in May, Daddy moved us back to Texas, back to the farm, and it was still right there, waiting for us. And then during that year,
You never did get those logs moved off the land that he
No.
cleared?
no, he couldn't do anything else.
He just lost his time.
He just lost his time and what little money it took to move us down there and back. That, and I don't know, he may have had to borrow that. I don't know about that part of it. But I turned 10 years old when we were down. But I thought that was the most exciting place down there because there was a little creek close to the house and there was trees. I thought it was the most gorgeous place I'd ever seen, that I ever would see this side of heaven. After living up there on the plains all those years, I loved it down there and enjoyed it. I didn't know that we was having such a terribly hard time. You know, after all, we still had water, gravy, and biscuits. So I didn't know we was having it bad. So we moved back to the farm, and Daddy's spirit was broken
Oh,
at that point. He never again had any zest or zeal for doing much of anything. And his mind began to get bad, and he began to show some signs of bodily harm towards grandmother and Marvin and I. And so he was committed to Wichita Falls State Mental Hospital. And that was in the fall of the year, and in along about May or June, he got pneumonia and passed away. And they said that his body had infection all through it, fed by prostate gland trouble. Knowing what I know today, I am thinking that Daddy died with cancer, prostate gland cancer. Now you'll have to remember I was 13 years old, this was 50 years ago, and most anything that affected the body or the stomach, you know, had different kinds of funny names and ailments that they call things. So,
How old
Daddy was 57.
How old was your mom?
Daddy was 9 years older, so she would have been 48. So, we buried Daddy at Blue Mountain Cemetery there. And at that time, the church was still standing. The cemetery is there. It's a pretty cemetery. It has all natural buffalo grass on it. It's real pretty on a rolling hill. And my baby brother that died, Ivan Merle, is buried there. And my Aunt Eva, her twins, and Aunt Elsie and Uncle Lambert, and quite a few of them. But after Daddy died, I went to live with my older sister Hazel. And Marvin had just graduated from high school. he went to live with my sister Alma, and she and her husband was in a home mission church in Louisiana at that time, Baton Rouge, Louisiana. And Marvin said that he ate so many turnip greens that winter till he didn't think he ever wanted to see a turnip green again. They was about to starve out too, you know, trying to get this little church started down there. It was bad. Well, I stayed with Hazel and Kenneth that one winter, and Mother sold the household effects and went to take care of a lady close by that had fallen and broken both hips at the same time. And so she was going to stay there and take care of this lady. And Mother was to be paid for it, so she couldn't take care of Marvin and I. So that's the reason we went to stay with our sisters. And I just stayed there one winter, and I came back to stay with Mother. And in the meantime, Mother had begun to see a little bit of S.R. Brannon, dating him occasionally, or I should say, going to church. He would pick her up to take her to church occasionally. And at the time, he was pastoring the Puritan Nazarene Church. And his wife had died before my father died. She had to have surgery. And it was a stomach tumor, which I assumed was cancerous. And the old doc undertook to do it by himself. And the veins collapsed, and they couldn't even give her blood transfusion. She died. December of that year, Daddy lost a girl by the name of Audrey. So he lost his first wife in August and Audrey in December.
That's his daughter.
That was a daughter. So then he and Mother decided to get married.
Was he the pastor of that
He
church?
was the pastor of the Puritan Church. He had come there from Borger. And they decided that they would get married if all four of Mother's children agreed, and all 6 of Daddy's children agreed. If everybody agreed, they would get married. Now, wasn't that taking a chance? So Daddy asked all of his kids. There was 2 that wasn't, 3 that wasn't married at the time. And Mother asked all of us kids, and oh, we liked him, so we really thought that was a good deal. So Mother and Daddy Brandon got married September the 7th, 1940. Mother was 50 and Daddy was 60. And at the time they married, they thought that they'd have a few short years together because they both were old people. Now you'll have to remember that the life expectancy about that time was 55, 60 years. By 60 years, you was an old man, old woman. So they got married. Mother had been married 30 years to B.J. Walker when he passed away. And then she and Daddy Brandon got married in 1940. And at the time that Grandpa Brandon died, he and Mother had been married 32 years. Daddy only lacked 1 month of being 95 years old. He performed mine and Wilson's wedding ceremony and died on our 30th anniversary.
Crying out loud.
And he was a wonderful man. He had great influence upon my children and my own life. He was an outstanding individual. And when we get to heaven, I want to introduce you to Daddy Brandon. Because I think he'll be listed with the saints. And I think all of my children would say the same thing, and everybody else that knew him. He was a great holiness preacher that established a lot of Nazarene churches across the country and had a real clear-cut view of heaven and knew where he was going And he can preach it straight, but preach it with such love and such kindness in his heart, until you knew that he knew what he was talking about.
Now, Grandpa preached his last sermon at what age at homecoming?
Mercy, I don't remember, but
He
it
was
was,
88 or so at
oh, I'm
homecoming.
sure that he was at least that old before he gave up tottering to the pulpit to bring a sermon, and you didn't have to guess what he was going to preach out. He was going to preach about holiness when he went to the pulpit. And he loved to sing in the choir. He had a beautiful tenor voice. Sang in the choir till they had to help him into the choir loft, and the men would get a hold of him and help him out of the choir loft for fear that he would fall and hurt himself.
And he sang good,
And
too.
he sang, he still had a pretty voice when he died. And he loved it. There wasn't any place that he'd rather be than in God's house with his family. And every grandbaby that was born, and then every great-grandbaby that was born, was the greatest blessing there ever was sent directly for God, and was the greatest. He loved every one of them, anticipated every one of their births to the fullest extent.
Married everybody and baptized everybody until he died.
And when people needed somebody to pray for them, I've known them to drive as much as 150 or 200 miles to get Daddy Brandon to pray for him, because he seemed to have a short circuit to heaven. And they knew Grandpa Brandon's prayers was going to be answered. And he loved Wilson with a, undoubtedly, he loved him as much as anybody could have loved a grandson. And I was always getting on to Wilson because he was such a fast, feisty little fellow. And Grandpa would say, "Now you leave that boy alone. There's nothing wrong with him. He's just a plain little boy." And he'd reach out with his hand and put it on the son's head. And he'd say, "This boy is going to do great things for the Lord one of these days." He said, "If we could just channel all of this energy to the Lord's work, this boy's going to live for him." He said, "You just wait and see. This is a good boy." Of course, all this time I was thinking he ought to act more like a girl. I'd never been around babies before in my life. I don't remember that I'd ever even changed a diaper before I really
Wasn't it Wilson that had the lump that was on his head that
Yes.
worried you so?
Yes.
And Grandpa.
When Wilson was born, he had a lump on his head, near about the size of a half of an egg, if it was stood on its end. And we took him back for a checkup, I don't know, 10 days old or something like that. And the doctor said, well, that this lump was going to have to be removed from Wilson's head. So he set up a date of surgery. And I went home with my beautiful baby, and I just couldn't believe that they was going to whack on my baby. And I was just heartbroken, and I told Daddy Brandon about it. And Daddy began to console me, and he said, "Now that child won't have to have surgery." And I said, "But Daddy, that's what the doctor said." He said, "Yes, but the doctor hasn't prayed about it." He said, "The Lord can heal this baby, and there is no need of worrying about a surgery." Grandpa went into the bedroom and got his little bottle of olive oil, and he laid Wilson on the couch, and he knelt down beside him, and we all knelt down for prayer with Daddy. And Daddy anointed Wilson's bump on his little head with that oil, and he prayed, and he touched heaven. And the next morning, the lump was gone. and he never had to have surgery.
And his brain was semi-okay after that.
And his brain was okay. He was a perfectly healthy little boy. That was the only thing that was wrong with him. Now, it wasn't my faith that healed Wilson at that point, I'll guarantee you. It was Daddy Brannon's faith that healed him, because up to that point in my life, I had never seen anybody healed of anything. Even though I'd been taught healing from the time I was a child, I'd never seen anything that instant happen before in the way of healing. But I think that was the first step in God's plan to teach me that God can heal. And I think that was in preparation for all of the years of fighting cancer that I've had down across the years. I think that was my first step, and I knew that God could heal because he had taken care of my baby. And when I stayed with Mother and Daddy while Wilson was small, a couple of weeks I guess, and then we went home and I handed Sharon her doll carrying the house. But she was mad because I handed her this doll to carry in. She wanted me to carry it and the baby too. So I went in and I placed my baby on the bed, and Sharon came in with that doll by one leg and just whopped that doll down on the bed and just crowned Wilson good. I mean, he really bellered. And then he had another knot on his head from a different source.
Well, we both used our dolls as weapons at different times, didn't we?
We both used our dolls as weapons, that's for sure. But when Mother and Daddy, after they were married, they, as long as they stayed in Perryton, Daddy was going to be continually called Reverend Brannon, and Mother was going to be Bertie Walker, because she'd been Bertie Walker for 30 years, 32 years at that point. And so they decided that the best thing to do, if Mother was going to be in the parsonage and be a part of Daddy's life, they'd better make a move so that people would know her as Mrs. S.R. Brannon rather than Bertie Walker. So they moved to Plainview, Texas in November, short while before I reached my 16th birthday. And Daddy began his pastorate there. And that's where I met Daddy. And I told his mother several times how much I appreciated her raising this cute little skinny guy for me to get married to.
Tell what you told your mother-in-law you was going to put on Daddy's epitaph.
Well, one time after we'd been married for several years, of course I always wanted to see the funny side and everything, and so I told Grandma Brandon, I said, you know, Grandma, I've decided that when Grandma McGuire, I said, when Wilson dies, I've decided what I'm going to put on his tombstone. She said, oh, really? I said, what are you going to put on there? I said, I'm going to put on there, just laying here a-grinning. And Grandma McGuire didn't see a bit of humor in that. I just doubled up. I've laughed about it dozens of times since. I thought that was real original and cute, but Grandma didn't see much humor in that. So that was when we met, and we met each other at church. There was a nice youth group there in the Plainview Church, part of which Wilson was part of. And I dated another young fellow 2 or 3 times by the name of Lawrence Lowe. But that Wilson McGuire told to me after we were
Well, all of us kids, and they didn't know, we were all rooting for this one.
He told me later the first time he saw eyes on me, he declared right then I was going to be his bride, so I didn't have a chance anyway any other direction. But we started dating, and we dated each other a little over 2 years because he had to wait for me to grow up a little bit before we could get married. I was a junior in high school at the time we moved there, and I just couldn't wait.
Okay, now this is where we want to see the picture of the pinup girl.
Oh, all right, get your picture out. I graduated from high school and just couldn't wait to get out of high school and get married and have kids and grandkids, and I did all of it in that order.
You had all those grandkids yourself, huh?
Yes, sir. Initiated the whole thing. All right, there is Daddy's pinup girl, right there. And you can't say she wasn't a cutie. You can see why he said she was going to be his bride one of these days.
He's still carrying that preacher.
Yes, sir.
Did you get a good shot of that?
Yeah, that's good. Here, hold it. I'll have to tell you where to hold it.
Okay. He about wore the top of it off.
He carried that, he's carried that in his billfold ever since we've been married before, I guess.
Turn a little bit more towards the window. There you go. Okay.
And after we were married, by 2 weeks later, he went into the service. We knew he was going to go into the service, so we got married October the 4th, 1942.
Now y'all married in the church.
Married in the church.
Had fresh flowers and wedding gowns.
Had daddies. Went out to somebody's garden out in Seth Ward and gathered flowers and decorated the church a little bit and had a simple wedding. And I still have a wedding dress pattern. I think it cost 20 cents for the pattern for Grandma to make my wedding dress. And I think my material cost me, I think it was $3 or $4 for my wedding dress. And it was a long dress and it was white, silky material, and it was real pretty. And I later cut it off because I needed a Sunday dress, so I cut it off, and I've always wished I hadn't done that, that I'd kept that dress. But anyway, that's neither here nor there. The dress is wore out.
Now you still had the veil, didn't you?
Yes, I still have the veil. I used the same veil that my mother had used at her second wedding. And so I used it also. And then we began to raise our kids, and Daddy was stationed down at San Antonio, Texas, and was a military policeman there in the Air Force, and was fortunate that he got to stay in the United States all of his tour in the service. And Irene, I came home in the spring of the year, and Irene was born, tiny little premature thing.
Premature.
Yeah, she was a
She was
tiny.
a cheap one.
She
You can tell who paid the bills.
was
What
born.
she cost you, a couple dollars?
No, I think it was 25, wasn't it, or 20?
Mildred went to bed one night. She woke up in the night and thought she had the stomach ache.
Thought I'd eat, there was some beans I'd eat the night before.
She had a baby.
I had a baby.
She had
She
a baby.
didn't know
at
she's
home.
having labor pain.
No, I didn't know I was having, I didn't know anything about labor pain. Nobody tried to prepare me for it, so I just had a baby. Mother and Daddy woke up and
Mildred's mother run him out to try to get a hold of the doctor. And he went down and got another.
well, my doctor had died. The first one that I'd gone to, when I got pregnant, I went to a doctor, what was his name?
Well,
Anyway, he had died, and I was using the service doctors. But when I went back home, for the baby to be born, I had to get another doctor, so we used old Doc Howell. And Daddy went and called old Doc Howell and told him to come quick, that Mildred Walker was fixing to have her baby. Well, he knew he didn't have any patient by the name of Mildred Walker, so he sat out, ate his breakfast, and took his own good leisure time. And it Daddy came back and Mother said, what did he say? And Daddy said, well, I told him Mildred Walker was fixing to have her baby. She said, Mildred Walker, go back and call him again and tell him that Mildred McGuire is fixing to have this baby and to get here quick. So Daddy went back and he called again, and I don't think the doctor was too excited. He thought it was the first baby and that it was going to take plenty of time. So he took his own good sweet time about getting there, and Irene had been born about 30 minutes by the time he got there, and a neighbor lady from the was close by there, they'd gotten her, and Mother said, well, what are we going to do with this baby? And Sister McLean said, well, all I know is just to be sure that her mouth and her face is cleaned off and just leave everything there till the doctor gets here. So that's what they did, and when the doctor came in and saw that Irene had already been born, I mean, tell you, he got in action fast. And he took me, cut the cord, and got Irene in the bathroom to weigh her. And we never did quite know exactly how much she weighed because he just had one of these old scales that you hold up and start a hook on the bottom of it, and he slapped her in a diaper and put that diaper on there, and the balance never did get still. It was still going up and down like this, and he took the baby off and handed it to Mother and said, here, get this baby cleaned up and in some clothes, in a blanket. And so we never did really know how much she weighed. He put 5.5 pounds on the birth certificate, I think it was, but I never did think that she weighed that much. She was too tiny. You could put her head right here in your hand and her feet didn't even come to your crook of your arm.
That was in the house on Baltimore.
And that was in the parsonage at 405 Baltimore Street, where Irene was born.
Cost $25.
And it cost $25.
Doctor charged you $25. Well, you know he paid
And
bills.
Wilson was still down San Antonio, of course, and I don't remember just how old the baby was when you got to see her for the first time, 2 or 3 weeks old.
7 days.
Was it just that quick? But he was kind of scared of her when he came home because she was so tiny. He was afraid she was going to break. So he was very cautious about even picking her up because he just knew she was
How
going to
much
break.
premature was she, did you know?
Yeah, she was about 6 weeks at least, 2 months early. So she was, Grandma took a little box and set it on top of a little desk that I had there and lined it on the inside with blankets and wrapped Irene up and fixed a little bed for her there in this little box. And we had to keep 2 or 3 blankets around her all the time. If you took, one day Mother took one of them off to wash it, or the equivalent to a blanket. She took it off to wash it, and Irene cried and cried and cried, and finally Mother said, that baby's cold. And so she went to the line to see if the blanket was dry, and it was. And it was a nice warm day because Irene was born the 26th of May. And she wrapped that baby up and nestled her up close to her and got Irene warm, and she went to sleep. But she was enough of a preemie that she had to have lots of warmth. And of course, in those days, you were supposed to nurse your babies. So that was what I tried to do, was to nurse my baby. That was the thing to do. And almost starved her to death. And her food, her milk didn't agree. What little I had didn't agree with her, and she had vomited up. And when she was 3 months old, she weighed 9 pounds. And by the time she was 6 months old, she weighed 12 pounds. And when she was a year old, she weighed 17 pounds. But that was about average for all of my children, my girls. all weighed 17 pounds when they were a year old, and Wilson weighed 18 pounds. He was the big one. He weighed 6 pounds and 15 ounces when he was born, and Irene being the preemie, and then Sharon was about 6'8", and Gail was about 6'9" or 10 ounces. So they were little babies.
The other three, when Mildred said, let's go, they were all born within 20 minutes from the time she said go to the hospital till they was born.
Who was born coming out of the elevator?
But you almost was. I had played the piano for church the night Sharon was born. And we had taken Sister McQuire, we had taken her home after church. And she read in the paper the next day where I'd had a baby, and of course she could always borrow more trouble than any woman you ever seen anyway. And she nearly died because she said, oh my goodness, what if that baby had been born on the piano?
Well, she was the one that was with Irene.
Yeah, she was the one that was with me when Irene came. And so we just had got home. We were living with Grandpa and Grandma McGuire. As soon as Daddy got out of the service, we went to Louisiana and we stayed a few months. Daddy was going to farm down there. I got pregnant with Sharon, and I wanted my mama. So he brought me back to Plainview to my mama. And so Sharon was born in September that fall, after we came back from having spent a few months in DeRidder, Louisiana. And I never wanted to leave my mama again. I was a mama's girl. My mama and I loved each other and was good friends, and I wanted my mama. And so she was born. Well, we went home after church and went to bed, and my water broke, and I said, we better go quick. And we rushed back to Plainview, which was how far away? 6 miles? 9 miles. And Luthine Landtroop was working at the hospital, and she was just fixing to go off duty. And Daddy had taken me in the emergency entrance and up the elevator, and just as he started to step off the elevator, Luthine was standing there. And I said, Luthine, for goodness sakes, get everybody into motion. I'm a-fixing to have this baby, and get everybody to going. And she turned around real quick and got me on a table and wheeled me in the delivery room, and Sharon was born. I mean, there wasn't no time for any preliminaries. Sharon was born. And and then with Wilson, we decided the Plainview Hospital was just too expensive. So we was going to go to Hale Center. Hale Center was 12 miles southwest of Plainview. And so we were going to use that hospital, the doctor down there. So we did. And I kept telling the doctor, now when my babies come, they come in a hurry, so you've got to be ready. Well, Daddy and I had put about 100 chickens, 75 at least, in the deep freeze the day before. He killed them and picked them and brought them in the house, and I gutted them and cleaned them and got them ready for the freezer. And here I was expecting Wilson most any day. And so we got those chickens all done, and sure enough, the next afternoon, about 4 o'clock, well, I had a water broke, and I said, let's go. We didn't have no gas in the car. And had to borrow Lewis and Ellis, his oldest brother and his wife, we borrowed their car, and he drove about 100 miles an hour all the way to Hale Center to try to beat the stork. And I mean, we barely made it. And when Wilson was born, I knew it was a boy before they ever told me, because the girls always had this little high, squeaky cry, you know, and when he was born, his was down lower. And I said, it's a boy. They said, it's a boy. And I said, thank the Lord, I won't have to curl his hair. trying to mess with the girl's hair. I never could make it look like anything. And I was so glad he was a boy, so I didn't have to mess with his hair. And of course, his daddy was as pleased as Clutch because he had a boy. And then 3 years later, well, Gail came along. And I knew she was going to be a girl before she was ever born because she was so quiet. And there wasn't much movement in my tummy. And I said, this is going to be a real quiet little girl, and she's going to be like her daddy. And sure enough, I had a beautiful little girl that had long hair, came clear down past her ears, just as black as a crow's. Prettiest little baby girl you ever saw. And she was just like I predicted, just like her daddy. Didn't have a whole much to say, and it was a real joy and delight to raise, and still a pleasure to be around. Well, how much more do you want me to talk? Are you about ready?
Sharon's
Let's
about
do
ready.
supper. Let's
Okay.
do supper.
Convenient that Daddy has to go to the bathroom more often now.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really helps me out.
He used to drive us ragged, didn't he?
Yeah, I'll take it.
Oh, thank you. He never wanted to stop till he had to buy gas.
Sharon said at the gas station, you had to be on the right side of the road.
That's right. One time, he pulled off, we was on a trip, and he pulled off the side of the road. So that all of us could find a tree to go to the bathroom. And Gail was uphill from Sharon. I'll tell you, she didn't do some hollering. That was the funniest thing.
I ran down the hill and started going, and Gail just stopped at the top of the hill, started going and running right under my feet and everything.
Did Dad kind of stretch it?
Oh, my, that was so funny.
All right, I'm ready.
Well, I thought of some incidents back there in my childhood yet that I thought ought to be recorded on this. And I was telling you earlier about how Marvin used to love to tease me. And we always had lots of cats on the farm. And I loved the cats. But I was definitely scared of the dark. When it got dark, I mean, it was dark. The only light that you had outside was the light of the moon. Well, it was Saturday night, and Mother told me to go out and get the number 2 tub and bring it in for our Saturday night baths. And I didn't want to go out there in the dark and get that tub. Now, all I had to do was step right outside the door and maybe take 2 steps and pick up that number 2 tub and bring it back up town. That's all the world had to do, but I did not want to go out there in the dark. I never have liked the dark. So, while I was a-piddling around about going outside and getting that tub, Marvin slips outside and gathers up all the cats that he can find and puts them underneath of that tub. So that when I go outside to pick the tub up, which he knew I was going to have to do eventually, sure enough, when I picked that tub up, the cats scattered every direction. And I just screamed like a Comanche Indian and threw that tub just as far as I could throw it. And he had put all these cats under there to scare me, and he did. And in the meantime, he was in the house on his bed that was there in the kitchen, just a-rolling with laughter. I mean, he was really laughing. Well, then Mother made him go out and get the tub because she knew that she thought he'd carried it a little too far, I guess, and she felt sorry for him. So I had to laugh after all on that. It was so funny. And then another incident that I thought about was when the first time that I remembered how wrong that it was to get angry with other people. And what you know, that it was just a bad feeling inside of you. I had planted some flowers, zines. And this was after school had started, 1st September. And my zinnias had just begun to bloom. Well, I had carried water in a bucket and put on these 5 or 6 little old flowers, doing my best to get this little pitiful bunch of flowers to bloom. Because it just, everything was just so desolate up there. And finally they were putting on their first blooms when school started. And on the way home from school, the Stallings boys walked through our yard and picked my flowers.
Oh.
And I'm a-telling you, they shouldn't have done that. I absolutely was one of the maddest humans. I was just beside myself. I was mad. Daddy had just finished putting tar on the roof of the house. And there was the bucket or a half a barrel or something was still there. And it had this tar in it, still soft. And and there was a stick in it. And I grabbed up that stick and I started in after those boys. I probably was 8 years old, something like that. And I started in after those boys, and if I'd have caught them, I'd have killed them, told the Lord, sweep them under the rug. I did never hear of them. And all this time, I was slinging tar just as hard as I could sling it, and I got that tar all over those boys' school clothes, which was a terrible thing to do. Because none of us, there wasn't a single kid in that school, I suppose, that had more than 2 sets of school clothes. From morning to night, you just started to school with 2 sets of school clothes, and you wore one day, and maybe the other one was getting washed, and that was just the way it was. And here I had messed up those boys' school clothes, and some of them didn't even have 2 sets. I was one of the lucky ones. I had 2 sets because I had some feed sack dresses. But they didn't. But I remember going off and crying later because I felt so ugly on the inside of my heart for having gotten so angry with those boys. And I realized that God was not pleased with us being that angry with people. And so I prayed and asked God to forgive me. Nobody ever knew anything about that till I was grown and told it. But I knew.
Did you get your flowers back?
I didn't get my flowers back, but they didn't pick any more either. There probably wasn't any left to pick.
They didn't pick them again.
Oh my. But I want to tell those 2 incidents, and then there was another about the Dust Bowl days.
Okay.
That was terrible. The dirt was blowing so badly on this particular day. And I guess it must have been on a Saturday because we kids were not in school. And Mother had cooked a pot of beans, probably with a little ham hock in it. And the dirt was so bad in the inside of the house that she would put just a little bit of beans on our plate at a time, and then before we could get any more, we would have to wash our plate because the dust was settling on our plates that fast, and she didn't want us eating the dirt, and so she had us to wash our plates off before we could get any more food. And the dirt was so bad in the house that in the middle of the day, we had to have a kerosene lamp burn.
Good, yeah.
Now that
It was just like it was cloudy.
it was just like it was night in the middle of the day. if there was so much dirt in the air. Now, this didn't just happen once, and it didn't just happen in our area. That was the Dust Bowl days. And when you see that story on TV, isn't it Centennial? Isn't that one where they tell about the Dust Bowl days? And they tell about the woman anyway that lost her mind from the dirt blowing so incessantly day after day. Well, now these were facts of life. These things did happen. They didn't dream that up for that movie. The dirt was just that bad. And people died with dirt pneumonia. They would put wet sheets over the windows, and if they went outdoors, they put wet handkerchiefs around their mouths to try to filter out as much of the dirt as they possibly could. And people died with dirt pneumonia. And one Sunday afternoon, Marvin had the mumps, and Daddy wanted to go to a singing in the afternoon over at Spearman, west of us, about 20 miles. And, or west of Perryton, about that far, I think. And we were 6 miles east of it. Anyway, we got over there, and that afternoon, this horrible, horrible dirt storm come in. Do you remember what year that was, Daddy?
About 37, no, 30, yeah, I might have been 37. It was toward the end. It was about the last bad one.
It was a beautiful sunny afternoon, and all of a sudden this horrible cloud came rolling in from the north, and it was red and black. It was horrible, and people thought the world was coming to an end.
Really?
Oh yes, very definitely. It was scary, very bad, and it didn't just come at Spearman. I mean, it rolled right on across the country like that, and you were already living at Plainview at the time, and it was there too. And if you'll check in history and newspapers and so forth, old man Dindy that lived up there on the corner from us had a black and white photograph of that on his wall for a long time.
And it showed up?
And it showed up, and when that thing...
Anytime they show the Dust Bowl days, they usually show that one.
Yeah, they usually do. But it rolled in on that Sunday afternoon, and we couldn't, the dirt was blowing so bad that we stayed there for a long time at the Spearman Church trying to wait for the dirt to quit blowing so we could get home. And finally Daddy got so worried because Marvin was at home by himself with the mumps, or just getting over the mumps, until he thought we ought to start on home. And he couldn't see the road to drive. And so he walked beside the car with the car window down and guided the car slowly down the road so Mother and I could ride. And he walked that way for miles till we got home to Marvin. And when we got home, well, Marvin and the old dog was laid up in bed, both of them fast asleep.
Didn't know anything was happening.
Well, if they did, you know, they was very
But
good.
he had to walk that car.
But he walked that car. I don't know how many miles. I think he tried to drive it for short distances, and it'd just be so bad he couldn't see it. He'd get out and walk the car some more. And we finally made it that 26, 27 miles back home.
How long do you think it took you?
Oh, I don't know. It was way up in the night before we finally got there. It was like 12:30 or 11 o'clock. But those are things that I thought the kids might find interesting. It's unbelievable that the dirt was that bad. But it was that bad in other areas. It wasn't just where we were. But it was real and it was horrible. Tell you for sure. Okay, let's talk about, okay, shall we talk about some of the fun things in our family growing up? And then we'll get back to Daddy's history, family history, after Wilson has to leave. Will that be all right? Wilson, what are some of the fun things that you remember as a kid growing up? Now, don't tell them about all the spankings like that.
Wilson, did you ever get a spanking?
I kept
Let
telling
me tell one on Wilson.
All right.
I told y'all the other night. One Sunday night after church, we were coming in, and Wilson was about to starve to death. He couldn't hardly stand it because he wanted to eat so fast. And he went tearing in the door just the minute Daddy got the key turned. He got in the house and went running in there, and he was about 4 or 5 years old. And he jerked the refrigerator door open so fast that when he jerked it open, he lifted up on it at the same time and knocked the whole refrigerator door off the refrigerator.
on top of his
On
head.
top of his head and all over the kitchen floor.
He was just he was just short enough that when he started to open that handle, he kind of pushed up like that, and the hinges just kind of set down in this little groove, you know. Scared him. That he knew he was going to get a cupping that time, but he didn't.
Knocked the whole door off.
Every time that I see what our kids do at home to help, I start remembering some of the things that I always do. I remember trying to stir the milk one time, and I knocked the hole out the side of the drawer or the jar, and milk went all over the kitchen. Stirring the cream and the milk up, and then I was cutting an apple and cut my hand one time.
Tell about the time you got the bee's nest, the wasp nest.
I was over at Grandpa McGuire's house playing, and we was playing in the peach orchards, the fruit trees, and I stuck my head in the wasp nest. When I done that, I got stung so many times, my head swelled up like a basketball, and my eyes was closed.
He walked up and we had a...
Doctor said if I hadn't died after all night, I wasn't going to, so I turned out.
He walked up to the picture window where we was all sitting and eating supper,
He had spent the night at
and
Grandma's.
he walked up and put his face right in the window, and we were all trying to figure out who in the world that was, because it looked like some kind of a cartoon character. Because it just looked like a fat face. You couldn't see any features or anything. It was just a fat face. And he stood there and just looked in that window at us, drove us crazy, until Mother finally said, "It's Wilson!"
That was one of the fun days of your life, though, Wilson. Did you
He
remember
went
how
around
much
through
fun
the
you had?
neighborhood and scared everybody. He went outside and chased
He was
everybody.
the monster that day, and he got to chase everybody in the neighborhood, and they had more fun. And like I said, we called old Doc Siegler, and he said, well, if you didn't die overnight, you're not going to die now. But he sent him out some medicine. But he made the most of his day.
Well, the other day I went someplace and this lady was wearing this real flowery shirt and kind of had silver hair, and I said, well, look at there, we got some blooming idiot in here. And I started laughing, and I said, well, I have to tell you the whole story. And so I had to tell her about the time we went camping and we went on a walk, and every time we found a wildflower, we'd stick it in Mother's hair or a blouse or a shirt pocket or a buttonhole. And she was covered with all these flowers and giggling and laughing and acting silly, so we started calling her a blooming idiot.
We covered her in flowers. All around her hair and all in her clothes. We covered her in wildflowers and weeds and walked her back into camp like that, calling her a blooming idiot.
I remember one time we went camping, and I don't know whether I ever laughed any harder. But we was up in Monument Lake, and we was camping in the tent, and so us girls, we'd go off up the creek and we'd take, or else heat some water and take a bath in the tent in the daytime. But the guys decided, these two guys decided that they were going to take a bath in the creek that night after dark. Wilson was about 11 or 12 years old. And Daddy got to aggravating him and saying, you can't do it, you can't do it, you're not man enough to do it. Well, he'd have died or done it, you know. And they got out there in that water, and of course it was ice cold. Oh, it was cold, eh? And you talk about screaming and yelling and carrying on. But Wilson would have died before he'd have come out of that water. As long as his daddy stayed in there, he could stay in there too.
They sure did yelp though. It was the coldest water. You wouldn't even want to stick your hand in it. It was so cold. And they both got in there and took a bath.
But we tried to always have at least one vacation a year, and that was about the only kind of vacation we could have.
We got there one time and I kept wanting to go fishing and they told me to go fishing, so I went over there and I started catching all these fish and I went over there and caught about 10 or 12 big trout and I came back and hung over the campfire and they didn't believe I caught them.
They were just trying to send him away to get him out of their hair, and he came back with all these great big trout.
You remember the time when we told Gail that if she'd put
Dirt, because she didn't want to waste salt.
put dirt on the bird's tail, she could catch it? And she chased this poor little puny sick bird all over the camp, and finally got some dirt on its tail and caught the poor little sick thing. She really thought she had done something.
We took one vacation one time through Gallup, New Mexico, and all around through an Indian reservation to see Jane and James Danielson. And Gail never did anything wrong. She was always Little Miss Perfect, never got in trouble, never did anything wrong. And we got out there and they had a swivel gate by a cattle guard to go in and out the gates out there on that Indian reservation to keep the cattle in. And she was swinging, riding on that swivel gate, and it was metal and had another thing under the bottom of it.
And had bolts.
And had bolts in it. Well, Daddy came out there and told her not to do that she might get hurt. And she waited till he went back in the house and got back on it and was riding it again like a merry-go-round. And got her toe underneath that, and it got caught between a nut and bolt and the pipe thing. So she cut her toe. And
Nearly all.
she went in the house and told him she cut her toe, and Daddy said, well, that's just what you get for not minding. And Mother said, go wash the blood off. And nobody was getting a bit excited, so Gail went in and tried to wash the blood off and kept bleeding, so Mother thought she better take a closer look at all of this. Got to looking and her toe was hanging off. She had cut it in a circular type thing, like that thing had moved, just an S, and her flesh was just kind of hanging off the end. And all of a sudden, Daddy decided it wasn't just what she deserved. He grabbed his baby up and had to drive 60 miles into Gallup, New Mexico to a Catholic hospital to get her toe sewed up and get it fixed. So the rest of that vacation, boy, she was pampered before, but she got carried around on a pedestal. And she got to where she could walk on the heel of the side of her foot, so the rest of the whole trip, she'd just hobble along on the side of her foot and go just as fast as anybody else could with that cut toe. But she really hurt herself that time.
Well, Wilson, what were some of the other fun things when you was growing up that you enjoyed? What about caravan trips?
Was he on that trip the night that it rained when we all went to Carlsbad
Well,
Caverns?
sure he was. Carbondale Drive.
Always rain when it's called that cameras.
We always camped out. Were you in the tent that time, or do
He
you
was
remember?
in the tent the water went through, weren't you?
Yeah.
They were camped up on the side of the hill. It came a real hard, fast, heavy rain. And they had their sleeping bags on the ground. Everybody had all their clothes and everything laying on the ground. And all of a sudden, they were floating down the side of the hill from all of the water going through there. And everybody's clothes got sopping wet. And so the next day, we all had to get up and put on wet, dirty clothes to go through Carlsbad Caverns.
But we didn't.
We didn't go through it.
No. To get to go through it.
The water was,
I just remember getting dressed
And they
in wet
closed the
clothes.
oh, well, it washed,
Couldn't get to it. Washed the road out.
it washed the bridge out. We couldn't ever get to it. So what did we do? I know you
We
kids
went
were,
back to Carlsbad and went to the beach. They had a beach on the river there.
and we went to a museum or something too, didn't we?
Yeah.
But the kids were, all of them was such good scouts, they wasn't any fussing or griping or anything about it. They just took it in their stride. We played around there, headed back for Plainview.
He pulled a good one on us one time, though. We went on vacation, and he was a junior in high school. We made a mistake of leaving him there by himself.
What happened?
When we come back, he had a savings account.
For college, for college.
College, we come back, he didn't have no savings account, but he had a motorcycle sitting in the front living room.
Oh, dear.
He bought a motorcycle
And
with his
we
college savings.
still loved it.
I bet it was some touch and go though.
It was touch and go. Don't let it fool you. It was touch and go.
What did Grandpa say?
It wasn't so much what Grandpa said. Mamaw said, "Oh, Wilson, how could you do this to us?"
He was talking a while ago about knocking the side out of the milk jug. Wilson, do you remember the time when you were going to help grandmother and grandfather Brandon by bringing in the milk when it had been delivered? The milkman left it on the front porch, and you were going to bring in this gallon of milk, and it was too heavy for you, and you dropped it and broke it. And I was in the kitchen with grandmother, and we heard the bust. We knew exactly what happened before we ever saw it. And I went to the front door right quick because I was afraid Wilson might have hurt himself. And he was no place to be found. Do you remember what you had done? You remember where you went? You ran home just as fast as you could go, and you got under your bed, and you was against the wall just as tight as you could get. And I looked under the bed, but I didn't look far enough back under, and I didn't see you. But you just knew you was going to get a thumping. And so you made yourself scarce, and all you was trying to do was be helpful. But you didn't get a thumping over that one.
Tell about the time he walked in his sleep over Grandma's and tried to get the corn and the beans out of the freezer in the middle of the night.
Oh, I got them.
He got him, was going to go home with him. Grandma stopped him. He walked in his sleep quite bad. I did too. I took a spree back there when I was a kid. I'd remember. I'd dream something, and I'd think a bear was going to get me or something in my sleep. And I'd fall off of the bed. That bear would start reaching for me, and kerthump, I'd end up in the floor. And so I'd get up and go in Mother and Daddy's bedroom, and I remember many a time waking up across the foot of the bed. I'd lay down across the feet. But Wilson walked in his sleep too. And one night he got up and we heard the front door open, and at about that time a dog barked. And he just slammed that door shut just as fast and went back to bed. But this particular time we were going to go on vacation.
Thank you.